Hi, welcome back to NonCompete. Today's video is hopefully going to be a short and sweet one. It pairs well with the last video we did on the Duoparty system. You don't have to watch that one before this one, but I do think the ideas pair well together, so I hope you'll watch that one if you haven't already. Anyway, today's topic is the fictitious notion of objectivity in journalism and how that notion ultimately ends up pushing the Overton window farther and farther to the right. So what is objectivity in journalism? Well, the concept first started floating around in the 19th century. There was a journalist named Walter Lippmann who had the idea of using scientific methods to do journalism. There was a trend in newspapers around that time, which you may have heard of, called yellow journalism, which was basically romanticized and dramatized, kind of tabloid. We would call it tabloid reporting nowadays, where, there's a lot of sensationalism and the focus wasn't so much on the facts as on really trying to sell newspapers, with these sensational stories. And Lippmann was like, well, we should really, as journalists, just focus on the facts. That was kind of his idea. And then the Associated Press, which was a cartel of newspapers, which still exists today, they decided that they would make more money if they could sell to different political stripes of people. If you could sell to Republicans and Democrats, you can double your money. So the Associated Press really pushed this idea of objectivity throughout the 19th and early 20th century, and now it has sort of been enshrined as this guiding principle of journalistic integrity, that you have to be neutral and objective and not take sides when reporting.
If your goal is to stay neutral on controversial topics, there are two things you got to keep in mind: balance and weight. Think of it like lifting a pair of dumbbells. If you want a balanced workout, you need them to weigh the same. On CNN 10, we want to keep our coverage like our diet, balanced.
And I want to make the argument that that's absurd. It's a ridiculous notion.
Don't just balance every controversy. Make sure the different sides are weighted the same.
A newspaper can't be objective. Journalists cannot be objective because every piece of media, every piece of propaganda, every piece of communication has to have a perspective, a viewpoint, a starting point. And with a capitalist newspaper, that viewpoint is and will always be the capitalist viewpoint or perspective. And that's exactly what we see in the journalism that we have today. So if indeed a newspaper were truly objective, then it would want to include every conceivable viewpoint that's at least remotely relevant. That would be the way you would want to report it.
For instance, let's say you're doing a crucial undercover expose on the breed of dog that makes its owners happiest. If you devote a minute and a half to Chihuahuas, extolling all the big benefits of the smallest dogs, and then you spend 15 seconds saying that Great Dane owners are howling in protest, you might say the story is balanced. After all, it has more than one perspective. But it's not weighted the same, dog. You've given 90 seconds to one position and 15 to the other. You've given one argument a leg up, so to speak, on the other. So to cover something objectively, you'll want to try to give the opposing sides equal time, or at least cover their opposing points equally.
So going by this dog example, if you really wanted to get an objective viewpoint, a truly objective viewpoint of dog breeds and which are the best and that sort of thing, you would have to interview an owner of every popular dog breed, and that's not feasible or possible. So realistically, and this makes sense, a reporter would have to narrow down the viewpoint, and in narrowing down the viewpoints that you showcase in your journalistic piece, you're engaging in a process of filtering out perspectives that you think the audience shouldn't or doesn't need to hear. And I'm not saying that that's even really something that we should avoid as communists. We will also have to filter out perspectives, but what I'm saying is that we, as communists, are honest and open about the filtering that we do. We say directly, we don't want fascist perspectives in our movement. We don't want capitalist apologetic liberal perspectives in our movement. We don't want to promote imperialism. We're very strident and open about our perspective and about the perspectives that we seek to avoid and negate. That's not something that capitalist media can say. They're hiding. They're being deceptive when they claim to be objective and neutral. They're being dishonest. And the truth is that they are favoring one perspective, and that's the perspective of the capitalist class. And it's exactly this filtering out process, which is how capitalist media engages in censorship, okay? It's not the kind of overt censorship that we're conditioned to be on the lookout for. This is a much more sophisticated and honestly effective form of censorship, because it's a form of censorship that happens right before our eyes and we don't even realize it's happening, right? So already this reporter has filtered out all the different dog breeds in the world to just 2. And guess what? That's exactly what they do with political information. They filter out all the viewpoints in the world and they only present the 2 wings of the bourgeois, capitalist-controlled duoparty system. What you actually get in a modern, mainstream, objective news source like the AP or Reuters or what have you, is the closest you could possibly get is showing the Republican, I'm being USA-centric right now because I'm from the USA and I'm most familiar with those media outlets, but you know, you could take whatever newspapers exist and news outlets exist in your country and kind of extend this metaphor. But the idea is you're going to get the like Republican or the conservative viewpoint, and you're going to get the liberal Democrat kind of viewpoint at best. That ties in with the idea of the duoparty that we discussed in the last video. So it kind of creates this Overton window in our space of journalism. Michael Parenti used the term perceptual reality. So they're building this perceptual reality, basically this box that your mind sits in, and you can't break outside of that box, right? Because the range of ideas you're going to be exposed to with this kind of quote unquote objective journalism is a range from liberal capitalist perspective to conservative capitalist perspective. You're not going to get an anti-capitalist perspective at all. And then, you know, there's many, many other perspectives that you're not going to get in that very narrow perceptual reality frame. What they're really doing is they're setting the agenda of the conversation. And we see this happen again and again with really every possible discussion topic that comes along. A great example of what I'm talking about from recent news is the comprehensive strategic partnership that Vietnam just signed with the USA. If you don't know what I'm talking about, if you don't know how all of that went down, my partner Luna has a fantastic video on that over on her channel Luna Oi, so you can check that out. As the press was covering that, you really got basically 2 perspectives. You got the liberal Democrat perspective in the USA, which was that this was like this great new era where the USA and Vietnam were like these close partners now against China. That was how it was always framed. And then you had this like right-wing conservative Republican viewpoint that this was bad because Vietnam bad and socialism bad, etc. And that's the only 2 viewpoints you got. They did not interview extensively anyway Vietnamese socialists. They did not interview American communists. So the only perspective that anyone got from reading news about that in the Anglosphere was that very limited, confined perceptual reality, which gives the very narrow bandwidth of capitalist perspectives that you can choose from. And that framed the entire discussion. They're not being objective at all. They're clearly have this USA, NATO-centric perspective when they talk about international things. Same thing when they talk about anything related to anti-fascism or communism, anything like that. They don't seek out the perspectives of communists when they talk about communism, either historically or today. So the way Parenti explains this is that they're not censoring information in the sense that they're like not permitting us to speak about it, and they're not forcing you to adopt one specific opinion, but what they are doing is they are controlling your perception of reality by controlling the range of discussion. Now, here's the really insidious thing about this notion of journalistic objectivity, is that in practice, what it ends up doing is pushing that Overton window, that perceptual reality, that narrow bandwidth of opinion space farther and farther to the right over time. Some people have called this a ratchet effect, and usually this is attributed to political parties where right-wing Republicans in the USA will introduce legislation and that normalizes things that are farther and farther to the right. And then liberal Democrats will just slowly tail behind them. They'll like slightly pull things a little bit to the left, but it's like 2 steps forward to the right, 1 step back. Capitalist journalism participates in this as well. And they do this by sharing the increasingly right-wing perspective and normalizing it.
We're here to talk about white privilege. We want to bring it back, make white privilege great again.
Because if we have to be objective, and if what objectivity means in this framework really means just sharing the liberal and the conservative wings of capitalist hegemony, then it gives carte blanche to the right-wingers to push things farther and farther right, which benefits the ruling class. And there are a lot of ways in which moving electoral politics to the right benefits the ruling class. It makes people who are in precarious, extra oppressed situations like trans people and disabled people, black folks, minorities, it makes them more afraid, rightfully so, and nervous and terrified of what these right-wing fascistic people will do. So you've got the stick, and it also, benefits capitalists directly by benefiting capitalists with tax programs, financial policy, giving billions of dollars to capitalists directly, etc. So it's always in the interest of capital to try to keep moving things to the right. But the only reason that the left, as they call it in capitalism, exists, and by that I mean liberals and Democrats and liberal parties in other countries, the only reason they exist is to more or less placate and fool workers into thinking that some of the capitalists are on your side. That's the whole conceit of this whole illusion that they're trying to build. And I'll give you a perfect example of how they are normalizing fascism right now in the USA. Trump just had, at the time of this recording yesterday, had this big fascist rally at Madison Square Gardens where overtly racist stuff was being said.
There's literally a floating island of garbage in the middle of the ocean right now. Yeah. I think it's called Puerto Rico.
The newspapers do cover it, and they, you can tell they're a little bit critical of the racism, but because they are objective, they have to show both sides. And, that's just normalizing this increasingly fascistic rhetoric, right, over time. Like if you look at how things have ramped up from 2016 to today with Trump's involvement in politics and this ever rightward drifting of the Republican Party, well, newspapers, by showing both sides and normalizing that we need to listen to both sides, normally this idea of debating these issues, which we have a great video on debate if you haven't watched that already. There's a link in the description. But the reason that they normalize this rhetoric is just to push things to the right. And then, you'll get the liberal perspective, you'll get Kamala critiquing it. So it feels like there's, all this discussion happening and that sort of thing. But in reality, the fact is that a decade ago, this wouldn't have been possible for Republicans to do this. But that rightward drift has just happened over time. Journalists have been showing both sides the whole time, and it pushes things farther and farther right. Never do you get, for instance, a radical, emancipatory liberation perspective. Never do you get a communist perspective about any of this. If they took communists and put them on CNN and interviewed them in the New York Times and that sort of thing, in the Washington Post, then you would be getting a much more radical perspective, a much more radically anti-fascist perspective. Notice that they never go in and interview like anti-capitalist, anti-fascist activists for these sorts of things, except for the merest token representation. And I mean, very, very minimal representation. And, that's all calculated. That's all to benefit the ruling class. Speaking of the Washington Post, great example of this myth of objectivity is that Bezos, at the last moment, quashed the endorsement that everyone knew was going to go to Kamala Harris because the Washington Post is like this historically liberal newspaper. Bezos, the capitalist that owns that newspaper, bought that freedom of speech that most of us don't have with his massive wealth, which he got from exploiting workers. He used that to buy the Washington Post, and now he is taking a stand to not take sides in this election. And that's obviously going to benefit Trump. That can only benefit Trump because it's kind of like we can all pretend, it could have gone both ways, but we know it was going to go to Kamala, right? So that's, again, just pushing things to the right, pushing that Overton window to the right, pushing the perceptual reality to the right, and benefiting the ruling class, benefiting Jeff Bezos's class. We can see time and time again how this idea of journalistic objectivity, all that it does is it normalizes an increasingly fascistic right-wing perspective in the media. It allows liberals to pretend and cosplay as anti-fascist when they're not actually materially, substantially doing anything to stop this fascist drift. It's building this idea that the full range of ideas, if you truly want to be objective, is only that little narrow bandwidth of ideas from liberal to conservative capitalist perspective. This idea of journalistic objectivity helps to serve the authoritarian capitalist Duoparty. And again, watch our very most previous video on the Duoparty system if you're not familiar with that term. But that's how it perpetuates this binary system where you have the Republican bourgeois capitalist party, you have the Democrat bourgeois capitalist party. This binary system works together to cement the position of the ruling class and to keep workers from having any real power and any real voice in politics. As communists, we know that this whole notion of objectivity is absolutely silly. Every analysis begins with a perspective. For us, it's a communist perspective, the perspective of the working class. That doesn't mean we shouldn't value objective information, that is to say, factual information. Of course that matters, but we are human beings, and when we're talking about social issues, there will be a social perspective, a social viewpoint, okay? And all that I'm really saying here is that the perspective of the capitalist press is ultimately always going to be the perspective of the capitalist class in this class society that we have. And the perspective of communists must be the perspective of the working class. And we should be proud of that. We should never pretend to be neutral or objective. We stand for the workers. We stand for our own class interest. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's this whole notion of an echo chamber nowadays, and people try to criticize or belittle people for saying, oh, you just want to be in an echo chamber because we, don't want to allow fascist ideas into our spaces or allow these even liberal capitalist perspectives to dominate our spaces. Well, that just means that we know who we are. We have a very clear idea of what we want, which is to end capitalism and class society and build a world where everyone can be free and equal. There's nothing wrong with that, and there's no reason to be ashamed of that. So we should be proud that we are not objective. We are proudly anti-capitalist, proudly anti-fascist, proudly communist. That is our perspective. If you found this information interesting or useful, of course, we hope you'll subscribe and stick around. And if you want to support the channel, we have a Patreon. We have a free tier where we have bonus videos every week or two. And, the greatest way to support us algorithmically, like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. But the greatest way to benefit us with the algorithm, which does us no favors, by the way, is to watch another NonCompete video right after this one. If you enjoyed this video, I really think you will enjoy our video on Elon Musk and how he bought free speech. It goes much deeper into the philosophy behind this video. And if you enjoy this kind of analysis and this kind of philosophy, I highly recommend that you check out our translation of the Vietnamese curriculum of Dialectical Materialism. Dialectical Materialism is the philosophy formulated by Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. It's really changed the way I see the world personally, and we've gotten so much positive feedback from hundreds of readers around the world who say it's helped them to understand the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels and other communists, and we really hope that you'll give it a read. The ebook is absolutely free at banyanhouse.org, so click subscribe, stick around, and we'll see you next time, comrades. I'm EJ. This is NonCompete. Take care of each other.